Okay, this is going to be part one of a two-part video that we're putting together of installation of our Edelbrock Carburetor kit. We're going to try and do our best to approach both four-wheel drive and two-wheel drive and crossbreed versions of the kit, why we do things certain ways. If you're impatient, like I often am, you can skip to part two now, which will be us actually installing this on the vehicle. This video is going to primarily focus on what we supply with the kit, why, and the optional extras that we can do with them as well, and when you may or may not need those optional extras. So, I'm going to pause occasionally, so when I make a blooper, we don't have to start from the beginning. So, the Edelbrock Carburetor then. We'll start with that, as it's pretty much the focus of this. We currently supply the Edelbrock 500 Performer series. We are now transitioning to the AVS2 a little bit. We're not actually supplying out to customers yet, but we're trialling on a few engines and getting our jetting profiles correct before we start selling to customers. We're absolutely, we've been happy with the Performer series. I've been here 20 years, never had any issues with it, but I think Edelbrock are now turning down production on this and moving over to the AVS2, so we want to try and be a little bit ahead of the game, or with the game on that one, with our jetting profiles, etc. So, the Edelbrock Carburetor though, when you purchase from us as this full kit, will be supplied with needles and jets to suit your engine capacity and specification. If for some reason you've got a specification or engine size that we feel we might not be able to best match, then we would advise you of that at the time and suggest that we would tune it as best we would guess, and that you then run the car with a wideband lambda sensor and check your air-fuel ratios on cruise and wide open throttle, etc. I would say 99% of the time though we're able to supply them without any issue at all. The carburetor will also come with the float bowl heights pre-adjusted, so we'll have done droop angle and the float height as well. We will have also pre-installed the fuel banjo for you. I would comment that it's worth making sure it's tight at the angle that you want it, because obviously we don't know what angle your fuel pipe's coming from, etc. So the reason we install that though is the port that normally comes off can foul lots of the air cleaners that are available for these, and the air cleaners that we supply as well. So we'll supply the fuel banjo. The vacuum ports on the front here, we will have already blanked off these two. The one on the right hand side is a constant vacuum port. It can be used for things like centre diff lock on a Land Rover 101. I know we've used it for that before, or an early two-door Range Rover Classic. It would have the same gearbox transfer box setup. The centre port, I think, is what Edelbrock say to use as a breather port. We have had negative effects from doing that. It scavenges air at quite a rate and can disrupt airflow actually into the primary choke area. So we like to avoid using that one. And then the port that we'll have left open here is the timed vacuum port for the vacuum advance on your distributor. We will also, if we're supplying this for the lower Offenhauser intake manifold, which we'll be talking about in a little while, we will have already adjusted this lower section of the bracket here. If left straight, it will actually foul the intake manifold. You could question, well, why don't you use a spacer plate to raise it up? The general reason for using the Offenhauser intake manifold is it's lower than the Edelbrock. We adjust this out at an angle to avoid the intake manifold, and we've been doing that for 20 years now without any issue. The other thing worth mentioning on this carburetor is the secondary ports are both vacuum and mechanically operated. So I'll flip it over first, Steve, to show the mechanical input. So if I open the throttle here, you can see the primaries open, and then the secondaries will open. And then under them are some valves here which I can flick with my finger, which, considering we're upside down, is why they're open. However, if I turn it over, you'll see they close and they will open with vacuum. So assuming you have the mechanical input and then you put your foot on the throttle, I can't do it from this side, and I'm not going to have a finger long enough to reach in from the top, am I? Nope. Probably not, no. So we need a device. Anyhow, the secondaries, assuming you have mechanical input, will then, if the engine's drawing enough air, will then open the vacuum of the secondaries there as well. The Edelbrock intake manifold then, we typically call this our four-wheel drive version, because we use it on all of our four-wheel drive vehicles, and also some two-wheel drive though. So We've got bonnet clearance under things like Morgan Plus 8. I think as well Triumph TR7/8's conversions depending on where the engine's been installed height-wise. So this is a dual plane intake manifold as opposed to the Edelbrock single plane intake manifold. What that means is we are drawing 4 ports from the left side of the carburettor, the outer 2 here and the inner 2 here, and then 4 ports from the right hand side of the carburettor, inner and outer. The only benefit of a single plane intake manifold would be in circumstances such as drag racing, circuit racing, where you're after absolute airflow, wide open throttle. That's all you're really interested in. The dual plane intake manifold and the dual port that we'll touch on in a second for the 2-wheel drive version is really aimed at your street or occasional track day use, etc. Things like that, where drivability and flexibility throughout the entire rev range is what matters. And that's what matters to, I'd say, 99% of our customers. We normally supply the 4-wheel drive intake manifold with our 4-wheel drive thermostat housing. We actually have this cast because they're not available anymore. So it's 4-wheel drive because the top hose is pointing off in the direction of the left wing. And we have the correct thermostat bypass cast into it as well, which we'll go into in more detail when we're plumbing in part 2 of these videos. Okay, so the Offenhauser dual port JWR intake manifold, which is what we typically call our 2-wheel drive version. It sits 1 inch lower than the Edelbrock version, so is generally used on MGB GTs and a few other kit cars like Cobra kit cars, etc., depending on what height the engine is installed at and what bonnet they're running. So this is called the dual port intake manifold. There is an Offenhauser 360 available, used. I believe they no longer make it new because JWR bought the rights to this and only have them cast as a dual port. That's the story, I believe. However, the 360 is like a single plane or open plane intake manifold, as we've discussed before, more typically used in drag racing type applications because it's all about maximum airflow. No one really cares about low-end throttle response and drivability when you're drag racing or circuit racing a car. This being a dual port, we're actually splitting the intake runners. And if I show you the Edelbrock intake manifold, you can see the difference there. So the nice thing with dual port is the fact that the primaries feed the lower section of this port here. So while you're just on part throttle, light cruise, you're only actually drawing air through the front chokes for sure, and you're getting increased velocity of air through the intake port, which means you're suspending those fuel particles really nicely. Then when you move on to the secondaries, and both the engine is demanding through vacuum and the driver is inputting it through throttle pedal, you're using the secondary ports and supplying air through the top section of this intake runner as well. So you're getting all the airflow you need for your engine. So the 2-wheel drive thermostat housing, when bolted on, bolts on in this position here, and obviously points up and forwards for most 2-wheel drive applications. Has the thermostat bypass hose on here, which we'll cover in part 2 of this video as to why it's important to have that. Okay, air filters then. Let's start with the 3-inch air filter. This is what we'd normally use on the Edelbrock intake manifold setup as our 4-wheel drive base. Obviously, generally you don't have any bonnet restrictions there. 3 inches high, 14 inches round. It does duck in and around the carburetor, and is supplied with this breather port, which you can install on in various locations, and obviously this rotates, so infinite possibilities of degree of angle there, and that will then go to your breather pipe, which we'll discuss in just a moment. Now the 2-inch air filter, which we deem to be the 2-wheel drive version, which we would always supply out with the Offenhauser intake manifold, 2 inches high, 14 inches round again, does duck in and around the carburetor. Another breather port, slightly different to the 3-inch high version. This one's pre-installed because we've borrowed it from an engine in the workshop, just briefly for this video. We would also supply this air filter in the instance when we're using a bit of a crossover hybrid kit. So cars like Rover P5B, Morgan Plus 8, you can actually use the Edelbrock intake manifold with the 2-wheel drive thermostat housing and a 2-inch air cleaner. Big advantage of that is the 4-wheel drive Edelbrock intake manifold is cheaper than the Offenhauser dual port 2-wheel drive intake manifold. And they both perform incredibly the same when you're actually driving and feeling the car through your body sitting in that seat and the throttle pedal. Breather pipes, we supply the kit out with a single pipe. This will suit most applications and will go onto the breather canister and then up to the port on the underside of the air cleaner. If you have rocker covers that have a port on both sides, I think MG original rocker covers are that format, and there are a couple of others out there as well, then let us know, because we can supply with a second pipe and a T-piece. It's not rocket science how they go, but again we'll cover that in the video part 2. Other parts that come in the kit then that you'll need to install this, we've got the choke cable. The carburetors we use are all manual choke, much simpler than the auto choke. That can be an absolute nightmare to set up and then reset up when the climate changes, etc. So nice manual choke there. A thermostat, always worthwhile fitting a new one when you're installing a new carburetor kit. The throttle cable and 4-wheel drive adapter bracket, adapter clamp. So on 2-wheel drive applications, normally the ball end here is correct for your pedal. In 4-wheel drive applications, we know for sure it's not, so in which case you just nip the ball off, install the cable into here, and you've got the clamp mechanism you need for your pin and clevis pin. 3 bolts to bolt the carburetor down to the intake manifold. Now what's the question we always get asked on the phone?
Why have I only got 3 bolts for my carburetor?
Because the 4th one is a stud and it's located with the bracket for the throttle cable. And then we'll also supply a couple of extra bolts for the thermostat itself, along with a thermostat gasket. Other gaskets that we supply in the kit are the rear water outlet gasket, the valley gasket end seals, and again we'll show where to put the appropriate RTV silicone on these in the part 2 of this video, and obviously a intake manifold gasket. One piece of advice with these composite intake manifold gaskets, which are the only ones we use, there's no need to use the tin one unless you're going for kind of an original look and you want that tin look that's going to go rusty after a few years. These are razor sharp, so be careful when handling them. I've cut myself on God knows how many times in the years of being here.
I think we all have.
Yeah, so there's that as well, and again we'll go through the correct sealants to use on that in the installation video part 2. Finally then, what will come in the kit is a length of water hose as well, to help you reconnect up to your heater matrix is the word I was looking for. So that will allow you to do that with some Jubilee clips as well. What we'll do now is we'll move on to the additional parts that we have available. Additional items then. The reason these items aren't included in our full kit is because, quite simply, they're not needed for all vehicles. So we'll cover these and talk about when you might need them. So starting with the breather pipe and T-piece here, again only needed if you have a breather port, I would say of about 19 to 20 millimeter diameter on both rocker covers. Generally only one rocker cover has that port on the canister that's on the driver's side rocker cover. The passenger side rocker cover generally just has a very small port on the back with a little foam filter on top of it. However, if you've got for some reason an additional port on the other rocker cover, then you would need to tee both breather pipes together and port them to the base of the air cleaner. The next hose here is this little S-bend. This goes from the thermostat bypass to the timing cover and allows correct flow of water. We'll go into flow of water in part 2 of this video in terms of the way the water circulates around the engine. You would need this if you're converting from EFI, because EFI engines don't have it. Most carburetted engines originally would have it. I think there's a couple of variations that don't, so maybe just have a look and see if you have got that short S-bend, or if you want a new one, let us know, because we can supply one at the same time. If converting from twin carburetors or maybe a Holly setup with an Offie 360 and you just want to full kit, then you should already have a rear water outlet. These are featured on the rear of the Twin SU Twin Stromberg intake manifolds. Again, if yours is corroded and you want a new one, then we can supply it. We supply it with the bolts, the gasket's already in the full kit. If you're converting from EFI, then you don't already have this rear water outlet, so you will need to add that onto your order. The other part here is a brake servo vacuum takeoff. Basically, it's a one-way valve. Again, you should have this if you're converting from EFI or carburetor. The thread's the same on all of the EFI engines. It mounts onto the trumpet base and will just unthread. The carburetor intake manifolds have them in as well. For installation on this, because we might not get to show it in part 2 of this video, on the Offenhauser dual port intake manifold, I'll spin this round, Steve, you can move the camera back then, look. This would install just under the rear of the carburetor there, and on the Edelbrock intake manifold all the way to your right, Steve, it will install there onto cylinder 2 intake runner. So that's supplying your brake servo with vacuum. Again, you should have one of them on your vehicle. If you'd like to renew it, then we have them available, or if for some reason you don't have an intake manifold, then we can supply it. Fuel pumps. If you're already carburetted, then you already have a carburetor pressure fuel pump and potentially also an inline fuel filter. We are now actually looking to stock a metallic billet filter as well, but we've been using these for a long time and we've got on with them very well. However, I understand not everybody wants a plastic looking fuel filter under their bonnet, so we can get some nice bullet black ones and other anodized colours, I think. We always use the Facet red top fuel pump, which again we supply as a kit with the correct unions on. The outlet pressure of this, this is a question we get asked quite frequently. Depending on what websites you read, some websites rate this at 6 to 8 psi, others rate it at 6.5 to 7.25 psi. That is higher than what the Edelbrock book will state. However, we do not run an inline fuel filter, and we have never had any flooding issues of the fuel chambers on this carburetor with that fuel pump. We've used it across all our engine sizes, 3.5 to 4.6, various different specifications. It supplies perfectly adequate enough flow for even a 4.6 stage 3 engine. The times when we've had cars in with regulators inline, a kind of a regulator with a filter built into them, we have had a few of those vehicles that have had a kind of a stumbling issue where they fall over themselves a bit when you're on a long accelerated pull, and simply by getting rid of that fuel regulator the issue is gone. So we don't like to use a fuel regulator in line. We like to just run the Facet red top directly to the carburetor via an inline fuel filter. If you're converting from EFI, obviously you cannot use your fuel pump pressure directly to the carburetor. Your fuel pump is probably capable of pushing in the region of 70 to 80 psi of pressure unregulated. That definitely would cause flooding in the float bowls. So we supply this inline fuel pressure regulator. It's designed to go from EFI pressure down to carb pressure. We also have gauge available to make it a lot easier to set that up. We'll cover on how to plumb this in our part 2 of this video. Obviously, if you are EFI, then depending on your fuel pump setup, you may actually decide you want to install the Facet red top fuel pump itself. Probably best to discuss that with us via email or the phone, just to make sure that how you're going to draw the fuel from the tank is correct, and that you're not going to still be powering your EFI fuel pump, pushing pressure into this, because that certainly wouldn't do it any good. The last item at the front here is our auto kickdown linkage, which again you're only going to need if you've got an automatic gearbox, but we will try and incorporate that onto part 2 of this video, although the video is going to be done on a 2-wheel drive Cobra, which is manual, but we'll at least show you how to install it on an engine and go from there. Okay, something additional that we can also offer with the carburetor, we've had to clear a bit of space to continue really, but is our power plenum, as we name it. Some people call it kind of a top hat. So it installs on the carburetor, seals down on a rubber seal on the base, and the primary reason for this that a lot of people use it for is for LPG. So it allows us to install an LPG mixer ring, conventional style, and then a K&M washable filter with a shroud around it. The reason for the shroud is LPG does want some vacuum in here to suck the LPG fuel in with the air, and this just makes that K&M work for its air a little bit more rather than just being an open air cleaner. That's the way we've been doing this for a long time now, and works incredibly well. Other advantages of this are it could be set up for a snorkel. In fact, Steve's going to overlay a picture now of a snorkel setup we recently did on a Defender 90. So you can trunk this to an inline air filter, as you can see here, which can then go up off to your snorkel. One thing to keep in mind there with an LPG system is you do, as I said, need vacuum in there, so with a forward-facing snorkel or something like that, you can actually end up with pressure and leaning the engine out, and end up with stalling scenarios in LPG with a snorkel setup, unless your snorkel setup is done right. So other benefits we've seen of this, we did a back-to-back dyno session a while back on a Stage 1 109 we fitted a 4.6 engine into. And we saw a gain of, I think it was 16 or 17% torque increase through the bottom mid-rev range just from fitting the power plenum, making sure the carb was jetted and set up correctly without it and with it, and we saw a lot better torque and throttle response and drivability down the bottom end, so it really does work wonders for them. We have another option available as well. This will fit under the bonnet of Land Rovers, a lot of off-road kit cars and things, trailers and that. But we also do a slightly lower version with the snout angled downwards slightly for two-wheel drive cars and those that might have bonnet clearance issues. This would allow you to then run your air filter down to a cold air feed or something like that. We've never done any back-to-back testing of cold air feeds to EFI engines or carburetors. We all know cold air is nice and dense and therefore contains more oxygen, which means you get more bang for your buck of air going in. However, I've seen a few back-to-back dyno sessions on various YouTube channels, and whether it actually makes a big difference in real-world applications is debatable, but this would allow you to at least do that. Final part to cover here that's on the table is the breather port here, which again we send out with these so you can mount it on the base for your rocker cover setup, as we previously mentioned. So, I think that's the end of this video, because the end earlier that we thought we'd recorded wasn't.
Yes. We didn't forget anything.
Didn't forget anything, no, not at all. So, everything you've seen in this video, we're now going to go through and install onto a Cobra kit car I've actually got in for a carburetor install. That'll be part 2 of this video. All of the parts you've seen here though are available from us. They're on our online shop, which is shop.v8engines.com. There's the plug, let's end there.